Hi, I'm Dan Fay from Sterling's to Coast Farmers, and today I'll be presenting our trial that looked at post-seeding deep ripping. The trial aimed to assess the effectiveness of deep ripping post-seeding to alleviate soil compaction on the sandy duplex soils that are common in the Great Southern region. Soil compaction is a key constraint to crop production in the Albany Port Zone. Deep ripping has proven to be an effective technique in reducing soil compaction. The optimum timing of deep ripping, though, falls after the autumn break and before seeding commences. This creates a very small window in which deep ripping can be done. Ripping too early, although it is possible, creates risk of wind erosion, whilst ripping too late creates an opportunity cost of seeding. So this trial aimed to look at whether deep ripping could be done post-seeding and how effective this could be. The trial contained 4 timings of deep ripping treatments and 2 control treatments. We looked at a 1 week before seeding treatment, which is standard practice and best practice for the area. So that falls after your autumn break on a typical year and before seed is in the ground, obviously. Then we looked at a 1 week after seeding, a 3 week after seeding, and a 6 week after seeding. The trial had an untreated control and a tramline buffer control plotted as well. And the tramline buffer control was because the farmer was essentially on controlled traffic. So we decided we would skip the traffic plots to reduce the effect that could have on results. Soil strength and water repellency was measured to evaluate the effectiveness of the ripping treatments on the soil constraints, whilst plant establishment, plant biomass, tiller counts, weed assessment, yield, and grain quality was measured to evaluate the effectiveness of the ripping treatments on crop performance. So for the soil measurements, we measured soil strength and, as an extension, soil compaction via a penetrometer. This is a digital penetrometer that took a reading every 25 millimeters to a depth of 700 millimeters. And the reading was given back in soil strength in kilopascals. So obviously a lower soil strength, the easier it is for roots to be able to get into that area of the soil profile. And as a general rule, at 2,500 kilopascals, that is a root limiting threshold for most cereal crops. Whereas at 3,000 kilopascals, that pretty much stops root growth in cereal crops. So soil strength was measured across all the plots, and we found that all the ripping treatments, irrespective of their time, reduced soil strength to about the same amount, as you can see on the graph. And this allowed the plants within these plots to access an extra 150 to 175 millimeters of the soil profile. So being able to access that extra profile not only helps with nutrient acquisition, but it also helps with water acquisition and aerates the soil more. So there's more room for the roots to grow. As I said, each of the post-seeding and pre-seeding treatments, ripping treatments, essentially alleviated the soil compaction to the same level. So from this, we can draw the conclusion that the timing of ripping didn't affect the effectiveness of the deep ripping itself. And we also found that the sustained waterlogging from the paddock that the paddock had suffered didn't result in any recompaction because we took these measurements at a few different time periods. We also conducted MED testing, which is a test essentially for non-wetting issues and soil water repellents. And surprisingly, given that this can often be an issue on shallow duplex soils, we found that there was no real constraint in these soils as a result of this MED testing. So then we measured plant establishment. All 3 post-seeding ripping treatments resulted in reduced plant and tiller numbers compared to the untreated control. This was largely a combination of both mechanical damage to the plants and a burial effect that the plants are suffering. The 1 week after treatment resulted in the lowest number of plants, yet it had a higher plant to tiller ratio. And what I observed in the paddock was that the 1 week after treatment, the burial effect caused a really high plant mortality, as a lot of plants didn't germinate, as they not germinated by the time the ripping treatment was applied. Whereas once the plants managed to break through, or the ones that did manage to break through, then thrived probably in a similar manner to what would have happened in the preceding rip. There was just a lot less plants. So there you see a much greater ratio between tiller and plant numbers. Whereas the 3 week after and 6 week after treatment, the deep ripping there both buried plants, mechanically kind of ripped plants out of the ground, and the plants that had already germinated then were already up out of the ground, looked really quite sickly as a result of this ripping treatment. So the plant establishment counts were done directly after the 6 week rip, and the tiller counts were done approximately 2 weeks again after that, so just to try and have a look at if there's going to be any recovery rate. And what we saw was kind of what we expected. When I was out there, it did look pretty disastrous after the 3 week rip had done, and then especially after the 6 week rip, because on top of this, there was also a lot of waterlogging. So the plants looked both nutrient deprived and like they had been seriously disturbed. The preceding rip fared the best, producing significantly more plants and tillers than all of the post-seeding ripping treatments. Then we measured plant biomass. This was taken at the same time as the tiller counts, which was around GS24. The post-seeding ripping treatments resulted in a significant reduction of plant biomass when compared to the control and the preceding ripping treatments. As you can see, the 1 week ripping treatment fared slightly better than the 3 week and 6 week ripping treatment. However, this had quite a large standard deviation. As I outlined in the previous slide, there was a lot less plants where the 1 week treatment was. So depending on where you measured, you had a result where the plants produced quite a bit of biomass, but there's just very few plants there. Whereas the 6 week and the 3 week treatment, there was a fair few plants still there, but they were not producing much biomass at all. They weren't tillering very well. And as a result, that's where you see they are lower in dry matter per metre squared than the 1 week treatment. The preceding treatment, once again, produced more dry matter per metre squared than any of the other treatments, including the control units. Now, at this stage, it was very waterlogged, and I would suggest that under a normal year, there would be a potential that that preceding treatment would have probably produced greater biomass than the control and the post-seeding ripping treatments. As at this stage, crop growth was quite stagnant, whereas I would expect in a normal year, you might see these graph kind of stretch out a bit more. I should also note that by this stage, the 1 week after plots looked quite healthy, and the biomass there was fairly similar to the preceding ripping plots, whereas the 3 and 6 week plots looked quite sickly. Harvest yields. All three post-seeding ripping treatments yielded less than the untreated control. The 1 week post-seeding treatment yielded only slightly less than the untreated control, highlighting the ability of the surviving plants to recover from the ripping treatment. Like I outlined in the previous slides, the plants that did survive and did germinate from the 1 week ripping treatment did actually go on to yield quite well and look quite good. Whereas the 3 week after and 6 week after ripping treatments looked like they were struggling all year, and this was reflected in the yields. The preceding ripping treatment produce significantly higher grain yields than the 3-week and the 6-week post-seeding ripping treatment, but not statistically significantly higher grain yields when paired with the 1-week ripping treatment. And the 1-week ripping treatment and the control treatment yielded about the same. Now, this would suggest that over the lifespan of the ripping, deep ripping treatment, given that it has an efficacy period of anywhere of 3 to 5 years, the 1 week after ripping treatment would probably, in the long run, end up being a worthwhile exercise. As you can see, there's only been a slight yield reduction from an untreated control this year. And you would expect that in future years, you'd get that benefit from the deep ripping that has been carried over. However, we've got to consider that we're comparing this post-seeding ripping treatment not to the untreated control, not to not ripping at all, but we're comparing it to pre-seeding ripping, which is the standard practice. And as we can see, there is at least a ton of yield loss from the 1 week ripping treatment compared to the pre-seeding treatment. So to suggest that 1 week after seeding ripping could be a viable option is only if there is not an option to rip pre-seeding. Waterlogging was also a major limiting factor for yield and likely influenced these yield results. Similar to the early season biomass, I would expect under a regular year, you would see this graph stretch out a bit more. And what I've observed in other ripping trials before is that there is generally greater than a ton difference between pre-seeding ripping and untreated control. So potentially that pre-seeding rip would have a greater benefit than what was observed in this trial. Just to wrap it up, I'll just run through a few trial observations. So like I said before, the 1 week post-seeding ripping treatment severely reduced plant numbers. However, the plants that survived went on and thrived. And in that picture in the top left there is the 1 week post-seeding ripping treatment just after it was done. As you can see, there's been an incredible burial effect there, and it has had a significant impact on plant germination. The yield penalty resulting from the post-seeding ripping is likely the cause of different stresses depending on the timing of the ripping. So by that I mean, we are not seeing the same stress or the same yield reduction from each timing of ripping, whereas the 1 week after ripping was likely caused by the burial effect. And this is important because this is something that could potentially be reduced by widening row spacing or removing inclusion plates from the ripping implement. Whereas the 3 week and 6 week after ripping treatments were impacted by mechanical damage because they were already up out of the ground. So the ripping treatment was, deep ripping was physically removing plants from the ground, and by the disturbance in the soil causing or exacerbating nutrient and existing stress issues. Which also was interesting to note that the 6 week post-seeding ripping treatment resulted in a severe weed infestation. Here, the 6 week post-seeding ripping treatment stimulated the weed seed after the pre-emergent herbicides had worn off. So throughout the rest of the season, that plot also suffered from a heavy weed burden. And though this didn't show up a lot in the yields, as it didn't yield significantly worse than, say, the 3 week post-seeding ripping treatment, this is then an issue and an extra cost that would be carried into the fallow period and the following season. Like I said, the use of inclusion plates on the deep ripper here likely heightened that burial effect and the mechanical damage that was caused to the plants. So removing these would potentially result in less damage to the post-seeding ripping treatments. Also, given the long-term efficacy period of deep ripping, it is likely that some of these post-seeding ripping treatments would become financially viable in their lifespan. Like I said, that 1 week post-seeding ripping treatment is only slightly worse off in yield in its first year than the untreated control. And over a 3 or 4 year period, the benefit of deep ripping would inevitably cover the cost of that yield loss in your first year. But what we have to consider is that we're not exactly comparing deep ripping post-seeding to not ripping at all, because ripping pre-seeding is still an option and is still the best practice. So what this trial really looked at was whether it is possible and what the penalties were for that. And I think there could potentially be room to deep rip post-seeding within that first week, and whether you can lessen the burial effect by widening row spaces, there might be room for you to get a viable yield that is not penalised too much in that first season and would certainly pay itself off in the long run. But given that seeding windows are quite wide, that you're probably still bumping up against the same opportunity cost as you would be by ripping that week earlier. Thank you very much. So this trial will be continuing next year, and we'll be tracking the performance of the crop that will be sowed on top of these plots. So this will be looking at how this deep ripping carries into the following year, and at the end of next year we'll have a greater idea of the economics behind deep ripping and whether these costs can pay themselves off and the effect of this deep ripping carried forward into the following year. I would like to thank the GRDC for funding this project and the Williss family for hosting the project. Thank you.